Hallow Pine had never been a kind town, and Wren Calder had stopped expecting it to become one somewhere around her 20th birthday, the year her grandmother's cough turned into something the local physician had no name for and no cure to offer. She had buried the old woman beneath the rowan tree at the edge of the herb garden with her own 2 hands, because none of the men in town who'd once tipped their hats to old Mother Calder for her cures had been willing to lend a shovel to the granddaughter who inherited nothing but debts, a leaning cottage, and 40 acres of stubborn, unproductive forest edge that everyone agreed was worth more sold than kept. 6 years later, she was still keeping it. 6 years of scraping together coin from tinctures and poultices, of walking 2 hours into town with baskets of dried herbs balanced on her hip, while the wives of the councilmen crossed the street rather than be seen buying from the strange girl who talked to the birds and never married and lived. Everyone whispered, a little too close to the deep woods for a decent Christian soul. She had learned to let the whispers slide off her like rain off oiled leather. She had learned, too, that hunger made a person forget to be proud, and pride was the only inheritance her grandmother had truly left her. That particular evening had begun like 100 others, the sun sliding low and orange behind the ridge, the last warmth of the day settling into the soil as she knelt, working hollow root cuttings into the bed behind her cottage, her mind on nothing more pressing than whether the frost would hold off another fortnight. The forest at Hallow Pine's edge had its own voice at dusk, the creak of old pine, the rustle of things settling into their burrows, the particular hush that fell just before true dark, as if the whole wood were drawing one long breath before the night began in earnest. The horse went down first. Wren Calder heard it before she saw it, a heavy, ragged collapse of muscle and bone against packed dirt, followed by a man's voice choked with something between a curse and a prayer. She was on her knees in the herb bed behind her cottage, sleeves rolled to the elbow, hands black with the last of the season's soil, and for one long breath she told herself it was only a deer crashing through the bramble at the tree line. Hallow Pine had a way of making every sound seem larger at dusk, when the light went the color of a bruise, and the wind came down off the ridge smelling of rain that hadn't fallen yet. Then she heard the man cry out again, and she was already moving. She found him at the edge of her fence line, where the wild grass gave way to the first dark teeth of the forest. A black horse, enormous, its coat slick with sweat and foam, lay on its side, ribs heaving in short, panicked pulls. The man knelt over it, one hand pressed flat to the animal's neck, as though he could hold the life inside by force of will alone. He wore a traveling coat the color of drying blood, fine enough that it looked wrong out here, torn at the shoulder in a way that told Wren it hadn't been made to look that way. Even in the failing light she could see the sheen of sweat on his face, the gray creeping into his complexion like a stain spreading under water. "She's dying," he said, not looking up. "She's dying and I don't—" His voice broke off. He pressed his palm harder to the horse's throat, as if he could dam up whatever was draining out of her. Wren didn't waste time asking questions a stranger collapsing at her fence line didn't deserve answers to yet. She crouched beside the horse, ran her hands down its heaving side, felt the too-fast stutter of its heart beneath her palm. There, high on the flank, half hidden by matted hair, a wound, small and dark, its edges an unnatural shade of green-black that had no business being on any injury she'd ever treated. She'd spent 6 years learning the difference between a wound that would heal and a wound that wouldn't, first from her grandmother, and then from the losses that came after, and this one told her everything at once. "Poison," she said. "Something worked into a blade or an arrowhead. This isn't a wild animal's doing." The man's head snapped toward her, and for the first time she saw his eyes properly. A strange pale gold, feverish, ringed with the kind of exhaustion that came from more than one bad night. "You know poisons." "I know herbs. Sometimes that's close enough." She was already rising, already moving toward the low stone shed where she kept her jars and bundles, her mind sorting through hollow root and bitter iris, and the tincture her grandmother used to call wolfsbane counter, though she'd never once had cause to use it on anything larger than a hunting dog. "Bring her to the barn if you can get her up." If not, I'll bring what I need out here. Either way, we don't have long." He didn't ask her name. He didn't offer his own. He simply nodded once, like a man accustomed to giving orders and unaccustomed to taking them. And then he did something that struck her as strange even in the chaos of the moment. He leaned close to the horse's ear and murmured something low and rough, not in the coaxing tone people used with animals, but the tone of an apology between equals. The horse got up. It swayed, and blood-flecked foam dripped from its lips. But it got up, and Wren decided that mystery could wait its turn behind the more urgent one bleeding green-black poison into her fence line. She worked through the last of the daylight and into the first hour of true dark, grinding hollow root into paste by lamplight, packing the horse's wound, forcing tinctures down its throat with more confidence than she felt. Her hands remembered the motions even when her mind raced ahead of them. The particular pressure needed to pack a wound without bruising the flesh further, the exact bitterness of hollow root that meant it was ready, the low murmur she'd use on frightened animals since she was a girl trailing after her grandmother's skirts through the very same barn. The lamp guttered twice in a draft from the door left carelessly open, and each time the man beside her reached over without a word and steadied the flame with his bare fingers, close enough to the glass that she expected to smell burning skin and never once did. The man, she still didn't have his name, held the animal steady with a strength that seemed almost too effortless for someone who, an hour ago, had looked ready to collapse himself. He didn't flinch when the horse thrashed against the pain of the cleaning, didn't so much as grunt when a hoof caught him a glancing blow across the shin that would have dropped most grown men to their knees. Wren noticed it the way she noticed everything in her work, filed away, unremarked upon, set aside for a calmer hour. There would be time enough later to wonder why a half-dead stranger moved like he'd never known what it was to be tired a day in his life. Outside, the last color drained out of the sky, and the barn filled with the smell of crushed hollow root and horse sweat, and the particular mineral tang of blood that never quite left a healer's hands no matter how many times she washed them. Somewhere beyond the tree line, an owl called once, and did not call again, and Wren found herself grateful for small mercies. That whatever violence had chased this man to her fence line had not, apparently, followed him the rest of the way. It was only when the horse's breathing finally eased, when its dark eyes stopped rolling white with panic, that Wren allowed herself to look properly at the man who'd brought it to her door. He was younger than she'd first thought, though something about his bearing made him seem older. The particular quiet of someone who had learned, a long time ago, not to let his face show what he was thinking. Dark hair pushed back from a face that would have been striking anywhere. Gold eyes that caught the lamplight strangely, like a cat's or a wolf's, though she scolded herself for the comparison the moment it crossed her mind. Hallow Pine had 100 old stories about wolves that walked like men, and she'd never had patience for any of them. "You should sit," she told him, nodding at the bench along the barn wall. "You looked half a breath from falling over when I found you." "I'm well enough." "You're gray as a corpse and swaying on your feet. Sit, or I'll make you sit, and you don't want to find out what that involves." It came out sharper than she'd meant it. The exhaustion of the last hour cutting through whatever caution she might have owed a stranger. Something in his expression shifted. Not offense, but a kind of startled amusement, as though it had been a very long time since anyone had spoken to him that way. He sat. She saw the wound then, the one he'd been hiding beneath his ruined coat, a gash along his ribs, dark with dried blood, the edges rimmed with that same unnatural green-black that had poisoned the horse. Whoever had attacked them hadn't been aiming for the animal at all. "That needs cleaning," she said quietly. "Now, before it does to you what it nearly did to her." He hesitated, the first real hesitation she'd seen from him. And for a moment something wary and old moved behind his eyes, the look of a man deciding how much of himself he could afford to let a stranger see. Then, whatever calculation he was making resolved itself, and he shrugged out of the ruined coat and let her work. His skin was too warm beneath her hands. Not fever warm, but warm in a way that felt constant, banked like coals rather than burning like sickness. She told herself it meant nothing. The way she told herself 100 small oddities meant nothing over the course of that strange night. The way his breathing slowed to something almost unnaturally, even once the worst of the pain had passed. The way his eyes seemed to catch the lamp's glow and hold it a half-second longer than any human eye ought to. The way he watched her hands work with an attentiveness that felt less like curiosity and more like a man cataloging a skill he respected and did not himself possess. "You're very good at this," he said quietly, watching her bind the wound with quick, practiced motions. "My grandmother was better. I've had 6 years of trying to fill shoes that never quite fit. She taught you. She taught everyone who'd hold still long enough to listen. Half the babies born in this valley in the last 40 years came into the world with her hands as the first thing to ever touch them." Ren tied off the binding and sat back on her heels, surveying her work with the critical eye of someone who never quite trusted a job finished until she'd checked it twice. She used to say a healer's hands should know a body better than its owner does. I'm not sure I've earned that yet. "I think," he said, with a strange, careful sincerity that caught her off guard, "you may have earned it more than you know." She told herself the same thing an hour later, when she checked the wound before banking the fire for the night and found the edges already knitting closed at a rate that had no business being natural, the green-black poison retreating like something that had lost its nerve. She said nothing, but she remembered. "You have a name?" she finally asked, once he'd eaten the broth she'd pressed on him and the color had come back fully into his face. He looked at her for a long moment before he answered, and when he did, something in his voice made her think it wasn't quite the truth, or wasn't all of it. "Kyle," he said. "My name is Kale. Just Kale. For tonight, that's enough of a name for anyone to have." It should have troubled her more than it did, but there was something in the way he said it. Not evasive so much as careful, the way a man speaks when the whole truth is a weight he doesn't want to put on someone else's shoulders, that made her let it go. Whatever he was running from, whatever had put poison in a blade and sent it into his side and his horse's flank, it wasn't her business. She'd fix what she could fix and send him on his way in the morning, and Hallow Pine would go back to being the quiet, overlooked corner of the world it had always been. That was the plan, at least, until she woke past midnight to the sound of something moving in the dark outside her cottage. Low voices, careful footsteps, the particular hush of people trying very hard not to be heard. She went to the window, pulse loud in her ears, the poker from the hearth already cold and heavy in her hand, though she couldn't remember crossing the room to take it. 3 shapes stood at the edge of the tree line, barely visible against the black wall of the forest. And even in the dark, she could see the glint of drawn steel. Not the crude farm knives a poacher might carry, but long, thin blades that caught what little moonlight there was and threw it back in a wicked, deliberate line. These were not men out hunting deer that had wandered too close to the tree line. These were men who had come with a purpose, and purpose, in Ren's experience, rarely traveled without cruelty close behind it. She thought of the wound in the man's side, the poison that had eaten green-black into his horse's flank, and understood with sudden sick clarity that whatever he had run from had not stopped running after him. It had simply been walking, patient and unhurried, to find him again. They weren't looking at her cottage. They were looking at the barn. Ren didn't wake Kale gently. "There are men outside," she said, low and fast, one hand already closing around the iron poker she kept by the hearth. More habit than real defense, but it was something to hold. 3 of them, at the tree line, armed. He was on his feet before she'd finished the sentence, moving with a speed that made her stomach drop, because a man who'd been half dead from poison 6 hours ago should not be able to cross a room like that. His eyes, in the near dark of the cottage, seemed to catch what little light there was and throw it back gold, the way an animal's did. "Stay inside," he said. "Bar the door. Whatever you hear, do not come out. This is my land. And in a moment it will be a very dangerous piece of it." He was already at the door, already shrugging into the ruined coat, as though it were armor rather than cloth. "Please, I am asking you to trust a stranger you have every reason not to trust, because the alternative is worse for both of us." Something about the please, the way it cost him, the way it sat awkward in his mouth like a word he didn't use often, was what made her step back rather than argue. She didn't stay by the door, though. She went to the window instead, and what she saw in the moonlit yard over the next several minutes would rearrange everything she thought she understood about the man she'd pulled poison out of 6 hours before. Kale didn't run. He didn't hide. He walked out into his own ambush with his chin level and his shoulders back, like a man walking into a room he owned. And when the first of the 3 attackers lunged from the tree line with a blade raised, Kale moved in a way that human bodies simply did not move. Too fast, too fluid. A blur of motion that ended with the attacker on the ground and the blade spinning uselessly into the grass. The second attacker didn't even manage to close the distance before Kale's hand closed around his throat and lifted him half off the ground with an ease that had nothing to do with ordinary strength. The third one ran. Kale let him go. Ren would wonder about that later. Why he'd let one escape when he could clearly have stopped him. But in the moment, all she could do was stand frozen at her own window, watching a man she'd tended like a wounded stray reveal himself to be something else entirely. The yard had gone terribly quiet after that. Ren counted her own heartbeats to keep from imagining what silence like that usually meant, and forced herself to stay away from the door despite every instinct that screamed at her to go and see. Once, long ago, her grandmother had told her that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the choice to keep still when stillness was the harder, wiser thing. And she clung to that now, gripping the poker until her knuckles ached, listening to the wind move through the pines as though nothing at all had happened beneath them. He came back inside 20 minutes later, blood on his knuckles that wasn't his own, and found her sitting at the table with the poker still in her hand, and a question in her eyes that he clearly owed her an answer to. He moved to the wash basin without a word first, scrubbing the blood from his hands with a thoroughness that struck her as almost ritual, as though he needed the physical act of cleaning to settle something roiling underneath. When he finally turned to face her, the exhaustion had come back into his features, deeper now than it had been even at the fence line hours before. "They're gone," he said. "2 won't trouble anyone again tonight. The 3rd ran and I let him, because a man who reports failure to whoever sent him is more useful to me than a man who says nothing at all. That's a cold kind of mercy." It wasn't mercy. It was strategy. He sat across from her, slower than before, as though the strength that had carried him through the fight had a cost he was only now beginning to pay. "I'm sorry to have brought this to your door. If I had realized how close they already were, I would have kept walking, rather than let you find me at your fence line. You'd have bled out in a ditch instead. Perhaps. It would have been a simpler ending for everyone but me." The bitterness in it caught her off guard, not self-pity. Exactly. But the flat, tired honesty of a man who had made peace with the idea of dying alone a long time ago, and was only mildly surprised to have been denied it this time. "I should apologize," he said, "for what you're about to hear, and for the fact that I cannot tell you all of it. Try me on the part you can." He was quiet for a long moment, weighing something. How much truth a stranger who had saved his life deserved, she supposed. "There are people in these mountains," he said finally, "who are not entirely what they seem. Families, old families, who have kept to the deep woods for longer than the town below has kept records. I am part of one of them. The men who attacked us tonight were sent by someone who wants me dead, and who does not much care who else gets hurt in the process." He looked at her, steady. "I did not lie to you about my name. I only left out the rest of it, because the rest of it is dangerous to know. And the horse, And your ribs healing faster than any wound I've ever treated." She said it flatly, watching his face. "That's part of the rest of it, too." Something flickered behind his gold eyes. Surprise, maybe, that she'd noticed, or respect that she'd said it plainly instead of pretending she hadn't seen. "Yes," he said. "It is." She should have been afraid. Some small, sensible part of her insisted that she ought to be afraid, alone in a cottage at the edge of the woods with a man who could move faster than the eye could follow and heal from wounds that should have killed him. But mostly what she felt, sitting across the table from him in the wavering lamplight, was a kind of tired, stubborn curiosity that had gotten her into trouble more than once in her 26 years. "My grandmother used to tell stories," she said slowly, "about a wolf court in the high country. A hidden kingdom that watched over the border villages without ever being seen. I always thought they were just stories people told to explain the good harvests and the wolves that never touched the livestock. They were never just stories. And you're part of it." He held her gaze, and something in his stillness told her the next words would matter more than any he'd said yet. "I am the reason the stories exist," he said quietly. "For now, that's all I can tell you. I would ask you to let it stay that way a little longer. Not because I don't trust you, but because the less you know, the safer you are from the people who want me dead." 2 days passed before Ren pressed him further, and in that time she learned more about the shape of him than the substance. The way he ate like a man who'd gone hungry more often than his fine coat suggested, wolfing down the first bowl of stew before catching himself and slowing to something more careful, more mannered, as though he'd remembered partway through that he was being watched. The low, careful way he asked about her land, her grandmother, the herb trade that barely kept her roof from leaking, listening with a fixed, unhurried attention that no one in Hallow Pine had ever spared her before. Most people asked after her only long enough to be polite before their eyes drifted elsewhere. He never once looked away. On the first of those 2 mornings, she'd gone into town for salt and found Thaddeus Vane's youngest clerk waiting outside the dry goods store with a folded letter bearing the council's seal. Another offer for her land, phrased in the same honeyed language as the last 3, promising a generous accommodation for a woman in her circumstances. She'd torn it in half without reading past the second line and walked home with her jaw set, and it was Kale, waiting at the fence when she returned, who noticed the tightness in her shoulders before she'd said a single word about it. "Bad news from the village?" "The usual news. A man who wants my land dressed up as a man who wants to help me." She set her basket down harder than necessary. "It happens every season. I've stopped expecting it to stop." "You shouldn't have to stop expecting decency. You should be allowed to be angry that you don't get it." The observation startled her, not because it was unkind, but because it was the first time in longer than she cared to admit that someone had suggested her anger was reasonable, rather than simply one more unattractive trait to add to the town's list of complaints against her. She asked more questions than he answered, and she found herself telling him things she hadn't told anyone since her grandmother died, about the debts left behind, about Thaddeus Vane from the village council, who'd come around 3 times now offering to take the land off her hands, at a price that insulted her intelligence, about the whispers in town that called her the strange herb witch who talked to wolves and would die alone at the edge of the forest, like her grandmother before her. She told him, too, about the year the frost came early, and she'd gone 3 weeks eating little, but the last of the dried turnips, too proud to ask the village for charity she knew would come wrapped in mockery. He listened to all of it without the flicker of pity she'd learned to dread from the rare person who did listen, and something in that steady, unpitying attention loosened a knot in her chest she hadn't known was still tied so tight. "They mock you," Kale said on the second evening, in a voice gone low and strange, "for living here, for the land. They mock me for a great many things. It's a small village. Mockery is cheaper than kindness and lasts longer in the telling. This Vane, he wants your land specifically, not simply any land?" She frowned at the sharpness in the question. "He's been circling it for a year. Says it's for a hunting lodge or a timber lease, depending on which week you ask him. Why? Kale was quiet long enough that she knew the answer mattered more than he wanted to say. Because your land sits against the old boundary stones, he said finally. The ones that mark the edge of territory my family has protected for 300 years. If someone wanted access to that border, for reasons that have nothing to do with hunting lodges, buying out a herb witch too poor to fight back in the village courts would be a very quiet way to get it. The words landed like cold water. You think Vane is connected to the men who attacked you? I think it would be a very large coincidence if he wasn't. The following morning brought its own small proof that the world outside her fence line had already begun taking notice of what happened within it. A boy from the village, Tam, the miller's youngest, who sometimes ran errands for a copper coin, came pelting up the lane breathless with news that 2 strangers had been found unconscious near the crossroads at dawn, their weapons confiscated by the night watch, their story about a hunting accident believed by no one who'd seen the wounds. Wren gave the boy a honey cake for his trouble and sent him on his way, and stood a long while after he'd gone, turning the coincidence over with a healer's suspicion of anything too convenient to be accidental. They'll ask questions in town, she told Kale, once she'd relayed the news. 2 strangers turning up hurt at the crossroads the same week I take in a wounded man no one's ever seen before. People here don't need much kindling to build a story. Let them build it. He didn't look up from where he was tightening the girth on the black mare, whose strength had returned with startling speed in the days since the poison had been drawn from her. Stories are easier for Silas to manipulate than the truth, but they're also easier for him to lose track of. As long as no one in Hallow Pine knows precisely what I am, they remain a poor source of information for him, however much they gossip. And if he decides the gossip is dangerous regardless, if he decides the safest thing is to make sure no one is left to gossip at all. The mare shifted under his hand, and for a moment he said nothing, his jaw tight in a way that told her she'd found the fear he'd been trying not to examine too closely himself. Then I will make certain that doesn't happen, he said finally, whatever it costs. That night, lying awake and listening to the wind move through the pines, Wren turned the pieces over in her mind. The collapsed horse, the poisoned blade, the careful, expensive way Thaddeus Vane had circled her land for a year like a man waiting for her to grow desperate enough to sell. She had spent so long believing her own hardships were simply the ordinary cruelty of a small, unkind town. It had never once occurred to her that someone might be engineering them. She fell asleep still turning it over, and woke to the sound of Kale's voice outside her window, low and urgent, speaking to no one she could see, until she looked closer and realized he was crouched at the tree line with his palm pressed flat against one of the old gray boundary stones, half swallowed by moss. His head bowed as though listening to something the stone itself was telling him. When he came back inside, his face had gone pale in a way that had nothing to do with poison. "The stone's been tampered with," he said. "Someone has been trying to break the old wards. Recently, within days." "Could it have been the men who attacked us?" "No." His jaw tightened. This required someone who knew exactly what the stones were, and exactly how to weaken them without breaking them outright. Slowly, so no one would notice until it was too late. He looked at her, and for the first time since she'd found him collapsed at her fence line, she saw something like fear behind the gold of his eyes. Only someone inside my own family would know how to do that. He knelt again beside the stone, running his fingers along a hairline crack she hadn't noticed until he traced it, and when he spoke again, his voice had gone distant, as though he were speaking to himself rather than to her. "There are 7 such stones ringing this valley, each one older than the town below, each one keyed to bloodlines that go back further than anyone living remembers clearly. Weakening even one takes months of careful, patient work. Work that requires knowing exactly which threads to loosen without snapping the whole ward outright and alerting every guardian for 50 miles. He rose, brushing moss from his palm, his expression grim in a way that made him look, for a moment, far older than she'd first taken him for. Whoever did this has been planning long before that poisoned blade ever found my side. The ambush wasn't the beginning. It was only the part of the plan I was meant to notice. Wren looked past him at the darkening tree line, at the boundary stone standing silent and gray in the moonlight, and felt the last of her certainty about the shape of her own quiet, unremarkable life slide away from her like water through cupped hands. Whatever was coming for this man in her barn, it had roots that ran deeper than she'd let herself imagine. And she was no longer sure, standing there in the cooling dark, whether she wanted to be spared the rest of the truth, or whether some stubborn, grandmother-shaped part of her had already decided she was staying to see it through. The name came out of him 3 days later, dragged loose by a night that nearly killed them both. It happened at dusk, when Wren had walked into town for salt and thread, and the particular currency of small cruelties the village kept in reserve for her. Thaddeus Vane found her outside the dry goods store, flanked by 2 men from the council, his smile as polished and false as always. "Still holding out on that land, Miss Calder?" His eyes swept her patched dress, her calloused hands, with the specific contempt of a man who mistook poverty for stupidity. "Word in town is you've taken in a stray. A man with no name and no history. Careful. Folk will start saying the herb witch has finally lost what little sense she had left. Word in town has never once cost me a night's sleep, Mr. Vane. It should." His smile thinned. "A woman alone, land she can't afford to keep, and now harboring vagrants who might be worse than vagrants. The council could take an interest in a household like that. For your own protection, of course." It was, she understood with sudden cold clarity, not a warning. It was a threat wearing a warning's clothes. And it confirmed, more plainly than anything Kale had said, that Vane knew exactly who was sleeping in her barn, and exactly why it mattered. The 2 councilmen flanking him wore the particular smugness of men who believed themselves on the winning side of something, and Wren found herself studying their faces the way she'd once studied a wound to guess how deep it truly ran. One of them, a heavy-set man named Corliss who ran the grain exchange, wouldn't quite meet her eyes. The closest thing to shame she'd seen from anyone in this town in years, and it told her more than Vane's honeyed threats ever could. Whatever arrangement had been struck, not every man attached to it was entirely comfortable with where it was leading. "You'll want to reconsider your hospitality, Miss Calder," Vane went on, when she didn't answer him. "Strangers who arrive with no name and no history rarely arrive without a reason, and rarely leave without trouble in tow. I'd hate for a woman already struggling to keep her roof over her head to find herself burdened with more than she can carry." "My roof has survived worse than your concern, Mr. Vane. For now." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "Give my offer some thought. It won't stand forever." She said nothing back. She'd learned long ago that giving men like Vane a reaction was giving them a gift. And she walked home with her spine straight and her mind racing through every possible reason a village councilman would know, or care, about a stranger's arrival at her barn, and arrived to find her cottage dark and Kale gone. She found him at the boundary stones, and she found him not alone. She'd nearly missed the path in the dark, following the faint sound of voices carried strangely on the wind, and when she finally came within sight of the clearing where the great gray stone stood cracked and humming with weakened light, her breath caught in her throat at what she saw there. A man stood opposite him in the deepening dark, silver-haired, elegant, dressed in traveling clothes far finer than Vane's best, with a face that shared enough of Kale's bone structure that the resemblance struck her even from a distance. Cousin, she thought, or something closer. "You look well, for a man who was meant to be dead in a ditch 3 weeks ago," the stranger was saying, in a voice pitched with lazy, dangerous amusement. "Truly, Kale, your instinct for survival has always been an inconvenience to everyone around you." Silas. Kale's voice had gone flat and cold in a way Wren hadn't heard from him yet. "Tell me you didn't come all this way just to gloat." "I came to finish what the poison should have. Nothing personal, cousin. The Council of Elders is tired. The border is unstable. and you insist on wandering the low villages playing at humility instead of ruling. Someone has to take the throne seriously. It may as well be someone who actually wants it. The pieces slid into place in Ren's mind with a violence that stole her breath. The throne. Not a wealthy family, not a hidden clan hiding in the woods for privacy's sake. A kingdom, a real one, ruled from somewhere in the deep mountains she had walked past her entire life without ever knowing what lay beyond the boundary stones. And the man she had nursed back to health in her own barn, the man whose broth she'd spooned and whose ribs she'd stitched, was not merely part of that wolf court her grandmother used to whisper about. He was its king. "You poisoned my horse," Kale said, low and lethal. "You sent men to finish what the ambush started. And now the boundary wards are failing because you've spent weeks weakening them. So that when I finally do die out here in some low village, no one will even notice the border's gone soft until it's far too late to matter. You always were quick, when it suited you." Silas's smile didn't waver. "Vane has been remarkably useful, incidentally. Greedy men make excellent tools. He wanted the land for himself. I merely wanted what sits beneath it. Everyone got something they wanted. Well, nearly everyone." His gaze flicked, deliberately, toward the tree line where Ren stood frozen, and she understood in that moment that she had never once been hidden from him at all. "Your little herb witch, for instance, is about to discover that harboring the true Alpha King carries a cost considerably steeper than a healer's fee. You've spent weeks corrupting a border 100 guardians died protecting," Kale said, "so that a greedy man in a low village could line his pockets, and you could line yours with something far more valuable. Tell me, Silas, when you finally sit that throne, will you at least admit to the Council of Elders what it cost? Or will you tell them the same pretty story you're telling yourself now? That this was ever about anything but your own impatience?" "Impatience," Silas laughed, low and humorless. "You call it impatience. I call it arithmetic. 300 years our family has hidden in these mountains, careful and quiet and humble, while the human world below grows louder and greedier and less inclined to overlook what we are with every passing decade. You wander the low villages nursing wounded horses and playing at being an ordinary man, and you call it wisdom. I call it a king too soft to see the walls closing in around his own kingdom." His eyes glittered, gold gone hard as struck flint. "Someone has to be willing to do what keeping this valley safe actually requires. It may as well be someone who isn't afraid to get his hands properly dirty. You poisoned my horse." "I poisoned an obstacle. The horse simply happened to be attached to it." Kale moved between them before she'd finished registering the threat, and what happened next unfolded too fast for her mind to hold all of it at once. A shift in Silas's shape that was not quite visible and not quite deniable, silver fur rippling briefly beneath moonlight before smoothing back into a man's shoulders, a warning rather than a full transformation. Kale answered it with something in his own stance that made the air around him feel suddenly, dangerously charged. And for one terrible moment, Ren thought she was about to watch two kings, because that was surely what Silas believed himself to be already, tear each other apart in her own front yard. "You won't win this quietly," Kale said instead, voice low. "Attack me here in front of a witness, and you lose whatever claim to legitimacy you think poisoning me in the dark ever bought you." Silas's eyes moved to Ren again, considering, calculating. And then to her horror he smiled. "A witness is easily removed, cousin, but you're right that it would be untidy tonight." He inclined his head with mocking courtesy. "Enjoy your borrowed time in this little hovel. I'll be seeing you both very soon." He was gone before Ren could blink, not walking into the trees but through them, a blur of silver that left the boundary stones humming faintly in his wake. And Kale stood in the sudden silence with his fists clenched and his breath ragged, looking for the first time since she'd known him, entirely unlike a king. The clearing felt smaller once Silas had gone, the air still charged with whatever unnatural pressure his brief shift had left behind, and Ren realized her own hands were shaking. Not from fear exactly. though there was plenty of that too, but from the sheer, dizzying scale of what she'd just watched. Stories her grandmother used to tell by the fire, half-believed and mostly dismissed, had just walked out of the trees, wearing a silver-haired man's face, and threatened her life as casually as Thaddeus Vane discussing land prices. "How long has this been building?" she asked quietly, once she trusted her voice not to shake along with her hands. "The two of you. This isn't something that started with a poisoned blade 3 weeks ago." Kale let out a long breath, some of the tension easing from his shoulders, though none of the grimness left his face. "Years," he admitted. "Silas has always believed himself the more capable ruler. Perhaps he's even right, in the narrow sense of ambition and cunning. But a kingdom isn't held together by cunning alone. It's held together by the trust of the people who live within its borders, human and otherwise. And that is a thing Silas has never once understood how to earn." "You're the Alpha King," she said. It wasn't a question. "Yes. And Thaddeus Vane has been working for the man who tried to kill you." "It seems so." He turned to face her, and whatever mask he usually wore had slipped entirely, leaving something rawer beneath it. "I should have told you the moment I realized how deep this ran. I let you keep tending my wounds and feeding me broth while a man who wants us both dead circled closer every day. I am sorry. You said you'd tell me when it was safer for me to know. It was never going to be safer. I told myself that because it let me stay a little longer without ruining the only quiet week I've had in a year." His jaw tightened. "But you deserve the whole truth now, whatever it costs. My family has ruled the Duskwood Pack from the mountains above this valley for 3 centuries, hidden from the villages we protect. Silas is my father's brother's son, next in line if I die without an heir, and ambitious enough to have decided waiting for nature to take its course was taking too long. He arranged the ambush that poisoned me and my horse. He has spent weeks weakening the boundary wards that keep this valley safe from things far worse than corrupt men. And he has been paying Thaddeus Vane, in coin or promises, to force you off land that sits directly over the weakest of those wards." Wren absorbed it in silence, feeling the shape of her whole life rearrange itself around a truth she had never once suspected. That her grandmother's stubborn refusal to sell, whispered about in town as foolish sentiment, had in fact been the last line of defense in a war she'd never known was being fought. She thought of the old woman's insistence, in her final fevered weeks, that Wren promised never to let the land pass to strangers no matter how desperate the debts became. A promise Wren had made to soothe the dying woman's fears, never once imagining it carried any weight beyond sentiment. "She knew," Wren said slowly. "My grandmother. She must have known, at least in part, what this land was really protecting." "It's possible." Kale's expression softened, just slightly. The old families of the border villages were often chosen as caretakers precisely because they could be trusted to hold ground without asking too many questions about why. It would not surprise me if she understood far more than she ever let on, even to you. The thought settled over Wren strangely, not quite grief and not quite comfort, but something adjacent to both. The sense of a dead woman's stubbornness finally making sense after 6 years of assuming it had been nothing more than pride. "Then he'll come back," she said finally. "Tonight or soon, and he won't be careless enough to leave a witness twice." "No," Kyle agreed grimly. "He won't. Which means we no longer have the luxury of waiting to see what he tries next." He turned to face the mountains rising dark beyond the tree line, jaw set. "I sent word to my guard the moment I understood how deep Silas's reach had grown. They'll come if the wards fail entirely, but a full ward failure is precisely the kind of chaos he'd prefer, because it gives him cover to finish this before anyone arrives to stop him." His gaze came back to her, steady and grave. "I won't pretend the next few hours will be safe ones. If you wanted to leave, to go to family or friends, somewhere far from this valley until it's over, I would understand completely, and think no less of you for it. I don't have family left to go to, Ren said, and precious few friends in that village who'd shelter me for more than the price of the gossip it would buy them. She lifted her chin, feeling something harden inside her that had been softening toward fear only a moment before. Besides, this is my land, and my grandmother's grave is under that rowan tree. I'm not running from it now. Not for a coward like Silas, and not for a snake like Vane. Something in Kale's face, watching her say it, looked almost like relief, though whether it was relief at not facing the coming hours alone, or something warmer and less easily named, she didn't let herself examine too closely in the little time they had left before moonrise. They came at moonrise. Ren would remember it afterward in fragments. The low howl that rolled down off the ridge like the mountain itself was grieving, the way every dog in Hallow Pine fell suddenly and unnaturally silent. The sight of Thaddeus Vane's carriage rattling up the lane, with an escort of hired men, whose faces she recognized from the tree line 3 nights before. He's brought the human enforcers as cover, Kale said grimly, watching from the window. Silas won't show his true face in front of witnesses from the village. He'll let Vane's men do the dying, and slip in through the confusion to finish what he started. Then we don't let him have confusion. Ren was already moving, pulling her grandmother's old iron shears from the mantel, the poker from the hearth, anything with an edge. You said silver unsettles him. I have silver needles in my healer's kit. Enough to make a point, if not enough to make a wound. Something crossed Kale's face that might, in a gentler moment, have been wonder. You're not running. It's my land. My grandmother held this ground against men like Vane for 30 years, without knowing half of what was really at stake. I'm not about to hand it over now that I do. The battle that followed was not the clean storybook clash Ren might once have imagined for a king's fight. It was chaos. Vane's hired men crashing through the fence line with torches and blades, shouting threats meant for a frightened herb witch, and finding instead a woman who threw scalding lye water and swung an iron poker with a fury 3 years of quiet grief had been sharpening without her knowledge. One man lunged at her through the smoke, and she caught him across the temple with the flat of the poker, watched him crumple into the mud with a distant, almost clinical satisfaction that surprised her, even as her hands shook with the aftermath of the blow. Somewhere behind her, glass shattered, one of the torches finding the dry stack of kindling by the woodpile, and the night filled suddenly with orange light, and the acrid bite of smoke curling up into the dark. Kale moved through the yard like something out of the old stories at last, fast and lethal, dropping 2 of Vane's men before they'd cleared the fence, his movements too quick for the eye to properly follow, more shadow than substance in the flickering firelight. A third man got close enough to swing a blade at Ren's unguarded side, and it was only Kale's hand closing around the man's wrist a heartbeat before the steel found her ribs that spared her. A heartbeat that cost him, she'd realize later. A shallow cut along his own forearm that he never once acknowledged in the chaos that followed. "Behind you!" she shouted, and he pivoted without needing to see, catching a 4th attacker across the jaw with an elbow that dropped the man where he stood. The yard had become a churn of mud and fire glow and shouting, her fence posts splintering under the weight of bodies thrown against them. And it was in the middle of that chaos, with torchlight and moonlight tangled together over the ruined ground of her yard, that Silas finally showed himself. He came not as a man, but as something between. Silver fur rippling over a frame too large and too fast, eyes burning the same feverish gold as Kale's, but hollowed out with an ambition that had curdled somewhere along the way into something uglier. He went for Kale first, exactly as Ren had feared. And for one terrible stretch of seconds, she watched the true Alpha King and the man who wanted to steal his throne collide in the open yard with a violence that shook the fence posts. It was Vane, in the end, who gave them their opening. Vane, scrambling backward from the fight with the particular cowardice of a man who had only ever wanted profit and never once understood what he was profiting from, who shouted the words that undid him. Silas said this would be simple. Said the wards were weak enough that no one would even... He didn't finish. He didn't need to. Every villager who had followed the commotion up the lane out of curiosity, and there were a dozen of them by now, drawn by torchlight and shouting, Thaddeus Vane's own neighbors and council colleagues among them, heard it plainly enough. Heard the name Silas spoken in the same breath as wards and weak and understood, even without knowing the full shape of the truth, that Thaddeus Vane had been selling out something far larger than one poor woman's land. Kale heard it too, and something in him seemed to steady, seemed to remember, in the middle of the fight, exactly who he was and what a crowd of watching human eyes meant for a creature like Silas, who depended entirely on secrecy to move against him unchallenged. You wanted this quiet, Kyle said, driving Silas back toward the boundary stones with a series of blows that were less about winning now and more about positioning. You wanted me dead in some low village where no one would ask questions. But you've just confessed to treason and conspiracy in front of a dozen witnesses, cousin. However this fight ends, you've already lost the only thing that ever mattered to you. You can never rule a court that watched you unmasked in the mud like this. Silas snarled, and for a moment Ren thought pure fury alone might carry him through anyway, until the boundary stone beside him, weakened by weeks of tampering and now flooded suddenly with the surge of Kale's true strength, reasserting itself over his own territory, cracked down its center with a sound like thunder and released a pulse of raw, ancient power that threw Silas backward into the mud, stripped of whatever advantage his sabotage had bought him. He did not get up again as quickly as he wanted to. By the time he did, 3 gray-cloaked figures had already come down from the ridge at a dead run. Kale's own guard, drawn by the broken ward and the howl that had rolled off the mountain an hour before. And Silas Ashworth, cousin to the Alpha King, traitor to 3 centuries of quiet oaths, found himself surrounded by kin who had come not to save him, but to take him. The eldest of the 3, a broad-shouldered woman with iron-gray hair and a scar running the length of one cheek, dropped to one knee before Kale in the mud without hesitation, though her eyes never left Silas, wary and hard. Your Majesty. We felt the ward break from the northern watchtower. We came as quickly as the ridge would allow. You came in time, Rhea. That's what matters. Kale's voice had steadied now, the king's authority settling back over him like a garment he'd only briefly set aside. Bind him. He'll face the council of elders for what he's done here. Treason against the crown, conspiracy with human agents, the deliberate corruption of the boundary wards. Let no one soften the charge for the sake of blood ties. He forfeited that mercy the moment he chose Vane's coin over his oath. Silas, held fast between 2 of the guard, laughed, a bitter, broken sound, with none of the earlier confidence left in it. You'll parade me before the elders and call it justice, and in 50 years some other cousin, tired of watching you play at humility in low villages while our world crumbles unnoticed around you, will try again. This isn't finished, Kale. It never will be, so long as you insist on ruling like a man who's ashamed of his own crown. Perhaps, Kale said quietly, but it's finished for tonight. And tonight is the only night either of us can actually do anything about. Ren watched the guard lead Silas away toward the ridge, watched the last of the fight drain out of him as the mountains swallowed him back into whatever justice awaited a traitor of his rank, and felt, for the first time since the whole strange ordeal began, the ground beneath her feet settle into something that resembled solid. The aftermath took longer to settle than the fight itself. Thaddeus Vane was led away by his own council colleagues before the sun rose, his careful reputation in ruins, his hired men scattering into the dark rather than face questions about who exactly had been paying them and why. The village that had spent 3 years mocking Ren Calder as the strange, stubborn herb witch clinging to worthless land, watched instead, in the gray hour before dawn, as gray-cloaked strangers knelt in her mud-churned yard, and addressed the man they'd assumed was a penniless drifter as Your Majesty. I should have told them the truth from the start, Kale said later, once the wounded had been tended and the guard had withdrawn to give them a moment's quiet at last. About the horse, about what I am, about why a king was riding alone and unguarded through a low village in the first place. Why were you? Ren asked. It was the one question she hadn't found the space to ask amid everything else. He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the boundary stones now humming faintly with restored, steady light. Because I had spent so long being told what a king should be, untouchable, distant, surrounded by walls of ceremony, that I had forgotten what it felt like to be simply seen. I wanted, for 1 week, to be a man a stranger might help without expecting anything in return. He looked at her, something unguarded in his gold eyes. I did not expect to find someone who would nearly die defending land she barely had the means to keep, for a truth she didn't even know yet. You looked like you needed help. That was reason enough. It should not have been. Most people would have turned a wounded stranger away, or worse, sold word of him to the first coin that offered. He reached out, hesitant in a way that felt strange on a man who commanded armies, and touched the back of her hand where it still bore the raw marks of the night's fighting. The village mocked you for your poverty and your solitude, Ren called her. They called you strange for trusting wolves and worthless for holding ground no one else wanted. I would like, if you'll allow it, to show them all exactly how wrong they were. Not as a king rewarding a subject, but as a man who has not stopped thinking of you since the moment you knelt in the dirt beside my dying horse and asked no questions before you started saving her. She thought of her grandmother, who had held this ground for 30 years without ever knowing the true shape of what she was protecting, and who had died believing her stubbornness was only ever about pride. She thought of Thaddeus Vane's sneering courtesy, and the years of small cruelties that had taught her to expect nothing from anyone who looked at her land and saw only its price. And she thought that perhaps the truest reversals were never the loud ones, not thrones or titles or crowds falling suddenly silent, but the quiet unmaking of a lie she had believed about herself for far too long, that kindness given freely to a stranger with no thought of what it might be worth, was ever really foolish at all. In the weeks that followed, Hallow Pine would tell its own version of that night 12 different ways, some claiming they'd always suspected there was more to the herb witch's land than met the eye, others simply falling quiet whenever her name came up. The particular silence of people rewriting their own memories to be kinder to themselves than they deserved. Corliss from the grain exchange came to her door within the week, hat in hand, offering an apology so awkward and overdue that she found herself laughing despite herself, and told him only that an apology mattered more when it cost a person something to give it. He'd left a sack of good flour on her step, unasked, and never once tried to collect on the debt of pride it must have cost him. Thaddeus Vane was never seen in Hallow Pine again. Whether the council quietly forced him out, or he fled before they could, no one seemed to agree, and Ren found she cared very little either way. Some reversals didn't need to be watched to be believed. The boundary stones, she said instead, because it was easier, for now, than everything else swelling behind it. They'll need watching, now that the wards are broken. They will. A faint, real smile touched his mouth for the first time since she'd met him. I find I know a healer with a talent for tending things no one else believes are worth saving. Perhaps she'd consider making a habit of it. Somewhere behind them, the sun was finally coming up over Hallow Pine, gilding the cracked boundary stone and the churned mud, and the fence line where, 3 nights before, a stranger's horse had collapsed and changed the whole shape of her life. Ren looked at the golden-eyed king beside her, at the mountains beyond him that held a kingdom she had never known existed, and understood that the real question had never been who he was underneath the ruined coat. A month later, when the last of the autumn frost had settled properly over Hallow Pine and the boundary stones had been fully restored under the careful work of Kale's own stonewrights, Ren stood once more at the fence line where it had all begun, watching a very different procession approach than the one that had first found her kneeling in the herb bed at dusk. This time there was no collapsed horse, no desperate stranger bleeding poison into her land. There was only Kale, dismounted, walking the last stretch on foot the way he had the first time. Not because he needed to, she understood now, but because he had never stopped wanting to be simply seen, rather than announced. "The Council of Elders has asked after you," he told her, a faint wry smile touching his mouth. "They are curious what manner of woman managed to outstubborn an entire ambush with nothing but lye water and an iron poker. Tell them I learned from a woman who once chased off a bear with a broom and a very firm opinion about property lines. I intend to tell them exactly that. It will do the old guard a great deal of good to remember that courage doesn't always announce itself with fangs and fur." He looked past her, at the rowan tree standing bare-branched over her grandmother's grave, and something gentle crossed his face. I think she would have liked knowing what her stubbornness protected in the end. "I think she'd have liked you," Ren said, surprising herself with how easily the words came. "Though she'd never have let you know it. She had very firm opinions about not spoiling anyone with too much kindness too quickly." "Then I shall endeavor to earn it slowly," Kale said, "for as long as she'd have found appropriate, and perhaps a little while after." It had always been who she would choose to become, now that the truth was finally standing in the light, and standing there in the cold, clean morning air, with a king who had once collapsed at her fence line now offering her his hand instead of his secrets. Ren Calder found she already knew the answer.